Hi everyone, welcome to Design Drives podcast. In this episode, I talk with Bilgi Karan, who I actually got to know during my studies at the Umea Institute of Design in the very north of Sweden, where he was giving a lot of inspiring and motivating lectures and did a lot of mentoring. Bilgi has made incredible experiences working with many outstanding teams throughout his career. For example, working at Sony on consumer electronics, working at TEAGUE in Seattle on aviation projects, and then working later on at above in Sweden on design consulting, and most recently leading many of these efforts at Ikea. Bilgi has always worked on the intersection of physical design and digital design, and this is exactly what we're going to focus on in the episode. The intersection of these two areas, how to design smart home systems which take into consideration both of these areas, and then how to lead design teams and how to grow yourself as a designer in a world of change and uncertainty. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. All right, thank you so much, Bilgi, for taking the time today to join us for an episode.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to speak to you. We got to know each other to Umea University, and you have been doing some really amazing lectures there, and we kind of got stayed in touch. And I think it's really great to connect with you after all these years. I think, I know you quite a bit, but I think for the audience, it would be really amazing if you could just give them an introduction about yourself, what you have done in the past, maybe a bit of overview about your design career, and how you end up right now at Ikea.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the nice words. I think I can start by saying I was born in the south of Turkey in, let's say, mid-70s. Without giving away too much about my age, I'm not that young. But then I started and my interest in design very early on. I think it was mostly about like solving problems and bringing parts together, but mostly a lot of curiosity about how things work, how they click, why we like things. And when I realized that everything is designed by someone, at some point I was super interested, and I realized that there is a thing called industrial design, and that really piqued my interest. So I found out that there was a school, so I attended the school, and it was a bit of an adventure going there and understanding what this whole profession is about. It was in Ankara, and the capital of Turkey. Then I think it took actually 5 years to finish the school instead of 4, because to be honest, I was a bit lazy, and I had very little self-confidence in terms of my work. But then afterwards, I got a job right away, which really surprised me because I thought that I was a very bad student, meaning that I would be a bad professional. Then I did some more design, industrial design, but I also learned a lot about all tricks of the trade, you can say, because I was working at a heating cooling company in there, working with almost everything, like from packaging design to industrial design. I did the surfacing myself, and interface design, like segmented LCD displays, all the way to color and material matching, and it was super fun. And then I got to learn quite a lot, but then I realized maybe it's not enough. So I wanted to study even more. So came to Sweden, to Umea, and studied advanced product design, as it's called. And I think that I had one leg in the interaction design side all the way from the beginning, and I had a really hard time deciding between those two. And that indecisiveness followed me through the rest of my life, you can say. So then I had different adventures at Sony Ericsson, and then Sony Mobile later, designing a lot of phones and accessories. And then at TEAGUE, working towards passenger and crew experiences on wide body jets for Boeing. And then at above, starting a digital design team from scratch. And then now at IKEA, doing almost the same thing, but still working with physical and digital at the same time. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, super great. And I think it's great that, you always said there's kind of interest in both the physical and the digital side. And I think now again at IKEA, you try to bring these two things together, right? So how was it throughout your career? Did you always had the chance to keep the balance of both of these things, or was it sometimes where you had the feeling now I'm getting very disconnected to digital design, or and maybe in other parts of your career where you said, oh, it seems like I'm really like leaving, physical design?
Really good question. I think at some point, I spent 8 years at Sony in total, and there, like we were designing phone after phone. To be honest, maybe I realized at some point what is happening inside the confines of the screen is much more interesting and impactful for the user than what we are really spending time on, the corner radius and the color and the, how the glasses come together on the edges and everything. So I really started to work with a lot of vision projects that kind of try to deliver more of this experience a little bit more upfront, you can say. And there, I think the transition started from there. And I think that at Sony, at some point, I was doing, you can say, a little bit too much physical, but I also donned the hat of, for a while, people started calling me Mr. Walkman, because I was working with the Walkman phones that always, had a very fair share of innovative form factors, and innovative form factors require innovative interfaces. And that really brought me close to digital and started to work with the people that are working on that side more and more. And at the end, I think my decision to transition to TEAGUE was quite interesting, because I realized that I can actually work more with in experiences that actually happen in physical space, but through enablers that come from digital world. And that really, I think, has been quite an interesting, I would say, catalyst to going there. Because when I actually accepted the job at TEAGUE, I thought that I would be working less with experiences, but maybe a little bit more with interior. But I think I shaped the job a little bit myself, you can say. And at the end, ended up with a small unofficial team, you can say, that worked with purely experiences. And we had to invent a lot of things from scratch, because there was no framework for it. And I had amazing support from our creative director and all of the managers in making this happen. So and afterwards, I think when I was at Above, it was mostly about being involved in maybe early on strategy towards companies that either had purely digital operations but wants to do something physical, or vice versa. And that in itself, where things really started to go into one another, I can say.
I think what is super interesting, what you just mentioned, is the aspect that physical design could enable digital experiences, right? And I made similar experiences. Could you maybe talk about that a bit more? Maybe you have specific examples or anything that comes to your mind where kind of how these two sides could influence each other, and sometimes the physical side could be an enabler for a new digital experience.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that Internet of Things is a playground, right? In the very beginning, I think we started just thinking about, oh, what happens if you could connect this thing to the internet. And it started to make more sense recently, I would say. In the very beginning, it didn't necessarily make sense, but some of the very early experiences with this that I had was like, we're talking about like making a dimmer for the home. And that was one of the first products that my projects, you can say, for Ikea, where we designed a dimmer that is basically like, it's just a puck, and it has no moving parts when it's functioning. And it's just working through a gyro and an accelerometer that just detects the movement. And it looks and acts like a normal dimmer that you would have on your wall, but you can just have it with you, and it has no, let's say, no rotary encoder or anything like that. It's just what it is. It is that product. And I think that's an interesting embodiment of the whole enabler is digital, but it is super encapsulated and hidden behind the outside. That's as a user, when it works well, you don't even realize that there is a digital aspect to it. You just feel like, okay, I'm using a dimmer. in its best cases. And I think that has been a very interesting project for almost everybody involved, and that was the wireless dimmer for IKEA that I worked on. I can also say that also marks a very interesting era for my career, where I really understood the importance of an algorithm into how a product is being experienced, even if it's something seemingly very, very simple.
I mean, you could almost say like the kind of there were so many, like the complexity is not even visible to the user, right? So like all the concepts, the ideas, the kind of the use cases, and kind of like the principles of outcomes, they're all hidden in this very simple object and interaction, right? But there's a lot of thinking around that, right? I think it's very interesting.
Yes.
When it comes to your process, combining physical and digital design, how does that process looks for you?
The process, I think a lot of the processes I feel like can be generalized into maybe exploration, experimentation, and execution. I mean, it's an oversimplification, but I think it works in maybe 80% of the cases. And a lot of our process looks like this. We try to ask, try, see, build, measure, learn, and then execute at the end. And you might be subscribing to a completely, waterfall or an agile process. You might be very religiously doing Scrum, but I think almost never fails to approach it like this. But when you combine physical and digital, there are some fundamental differences. Like for when you're shipping a physical product, there is an end date where you have to pack this thing in boxes, and you no longer can play with the firmware, and it is what it is. If it's an internet enabled product, the first time it is unboxed, it can connect to the internet and update itself. But you can't necessarily count on it. I mean, in our case, we have a lot of products that might not be connected to the internet ever, and we have to think about that. In the pure digital process, you are counting on very frequent updates. So it's a little bit tough to reconcile these two processes together, especially the cadence is quite different. So you can't necessarily. And then on the other hand, also in the area of smart home, there is also a different software projects, if you will. Like there's the firmware, there's the gateway, there's the cloud, and there's integrations, and they all have different cadence, security limitations, and when it comes together, it really looks like a very, very complicated, like spaghetti kind of chaos. But you have to, as a leader, make sense out of that and make sure that there's actionable points in each way and each week, maybe each day. And that's one of the challenges, but it's also what makes it exciting and interesting, I see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're pointing out some really interesting aspects. I think one of the things that I would be very curious about is like how do you align it from the timeline perspective? Almost, you already said it's like on the physical side you're gonna have a due date. After that, you can't change anything anymore, right? It's not like on the interface I can still adjust the radius. On the physical one, it's done, right? So it's gonna be shipped, right? So I also all the interaction elements, for example, placed into these physical elements have to be considered. They have to be considered even for the long run a little bit, because I may be cutting myself short in terms of the physical enablers I have in the product when I, for example, go launch a software update at a later point. I can't now update this product anymore because it doesn't have that hinge I wanted, but that comes in the next release. So I was just wondering, how do you kind of structure that? Is it that on the digital side you have to think further ahead because you have to think about the physical requirements and what the physical element has to enable?
I think one of the, let's say, maybe I would almost say like happy side effects of this whole phenomena is that as designers, you have to be much more aware of the limitations of the technology, but also there are, let's say, super tiny switches that you can turn on and off in the very early in the process when you're doing the first architecture of a whole new platform. And as a designer, you need to understand the technology much more than a typical, let's say, a traditional process would require, so that you can understand, okay, if we have this switch down the line, we won't be able to have such feature. And that is quite a challenge. And that's why we're also, like, sometimes some of our designers have the assignment of being a UX architect, which you don't see very much in a lot of other places, because you really need to be able to foresee the impacts of these tiny, micro decisions, what they might be down the line. And we also maybe developed some coping mechanisms, or some ways of dealing with this, such as we work with principles quite a lot, and we derive principles from the mistakes that we have done. And one of the principles that we have is the escalator principle, which basically says, like, if you have, imagine an escalator, even when it fails, it is still a set of staircase, basically. And so we are designing our products like that. So even, for example, if you lose the remote control to a smart light bulb, it becomes a dumb light bulb, and you can still use the light switch. And this is like a super tiny thing that you have to think about very much on the architecture level, on the software architecture, even like a platform architecture level. And it's really hard to foresee. And I cannot say that we can foresee all of these things, and we haven't solved everything. But we're trying our best to be able to do it properly.
Super interesting. Yeah, you have to think about the fallback, right? So, like, what is the kind of baseline functionality and experience that it can offer at any time, right? And how I do I stack up on top of it, right? To offer, for example, a better experience.
Yes.
Super interesting. So, I mean, another aspect, obviously, is technology itself, right? So, I mean, we have a technological innovation, right? So how do you try to, is that also part of the conversation? How do you balance that with your process, thinking about what you want to do in the long run, maybe on an interaction side, but then you also have to consider technology aspects as well, and maybe think that maybe enabler that come from an engineering and a technical side?
That's a really interesting question. That's a question that I asked myself so many times. And it is maybe at some point in life, I was working a lot with innovative projects, and especially at Sony, because of the way that the company is structured and everything, like innovation is everything and progress is everything. And a lot of the times you would come across an engineer or a group of engineers that would have a fantastic, a brilliant technology. And maybe management would ask designers to find a use case for it. I'm doing air quotes for the people who are, listening. And then I have yet to see that process work, actually, to find a use case for a new technology. Instead, what we are doing today is more like when we see a new technology, we are looking at it and we're like, let's trying to understand what is under the hood, what makes it tick, what is interesting about it, why is it interesting, maybe run an exploration project around it to really go down to the details of it. But then we put it aside, we put it in our backpack. And when we come across a problem that might be a fantastic fit for that specific technology, then we pick it up again, instead of trying to fit it into whatever hole that is in front of us. That we found, I think that also reflects the maybe the spirit of IKEA currently, but I also found that it works pretty well in other organizations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You wanna come from the user first, right? But then you have it in your backpack, so you can pull it out as a potential solution, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, super interesting. So another thing that's potentially challenging is, I guess, like user research and market research when it comes to smart home experiences, right? Because you have to really set it up for people, and get their feedback and prototype it, everything kind of in a room or in an experience. And it's also, there's this aspect of habits as well. So maybe people have a hard time, right? Maybe they see a functional element that could work very well, but or they because some of the things or some of the use cases maybe are incorporated into habits, right? So is this because a lot of things actually at home they happen automatically. People have certain habits in terms of how they're doing things. So just maybe more general, how do you do user and market research when it comes to use cases and scenarios and design solutions you come up with?
We are very curious about how people live. I mean, and that is ingrained in our everyday and in our culture as well. So curiosity about life at home is what drives us most of the time, 100%. And that also includes how they interact with their current home. So we are not there to change their habits if they are not willing to. And we are very mindful of this. Like today, in the smart home, you can see that you can see a lot of like smart home enthusiasts trying to maybe change the habit of the whole household. Like, okay, stop using the wall switch or stop doing this. And okay, now the blinds are automatic, you don't touch them. And we see this in our research every day. But we're also wondering where is the point of reconciliation between these two, like habits and newness that can actually make something much better and much easier for everybody. And that's why we are working with these kind of products that are, for example, the shortcut button. It's just a button that has like you can put whatever drawing underneath you want, and maybe the person that can program it in a way that it does like a lot of things at the same time. It maybe is your morning routine, or maybe you can just assign it for to a certain playlist in the morning. So every time you press it, it just starts playing a coffee house playlist, so on. You can have multiples of these. So we're also like very curious about how we help people to have better habits that save them time, save them money, save them energy, and different things. But we are also very aware that we are in a business of maybe habit changing kind of products. But it's not like, for example, when you look at exercise and or similar things where you want to increase the well-being of people. Maybe it's a little bit different than that. So we have to understand how people live to be able to suggest them slight nudges that can make their life a little bit better, a little bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, super interesting. Actually, the first episodes of Design Drive was with Cheryl Platz, who was actually the first designer, one of the first designers on Amazon Echo team, and they have to come up with these different use cases for smart home devices, right? As it was basically one of the first smart home products. And she was really interested. It was very interesting to hear about the prototyping process and how they used role play as a way to kind of evaluate if certain scenarios make sense from a user experience perspective. So it was not even a building AI or any of that in the very beginning. It was just understanding, does that interaction make sense for me in my everyday life? Does it feel awkward? Does it feel like I have to force myself to ask this to an intelligent machine, or does it actually help me? So what kind of scenarios make sense for people? What are the kind of key use cases? And they did role play for that to kind of play it out before they actually went into doing the AI and all of these technical things. And I think this was very interesting because you could play it out almost in different rooms, right? You have a bathroom, you're trying to play out a morning scenario. What would you say now to that device? Try to play it out for yourself. So I'm wondering a little bit about the prototyping process when it comes to smart home experience. Do we have any kind of similar experience when it comes to you in terms of like role play, for example, as a tool for prototyping, or how do you try to do that?
I think that sounds like I mean that story is very, let's say, interesting, because how do you prototype something that never existed before? And I think in those situations, we're also I also joke with the team sometimes, like we are reinventing the process every time, or we are inventing a new process every time. We are inventing new methods, new methodologies. Otherwise, there is no like playbook for a lot of the things that we are dealing with. Smart home and IoT is still in its infancy. One of the things that I find quite helpful also for myself and also for anybody that would work with this, is like things like body storming, really understanding, because the digital interfaces and the digital things that like all those zeros and ones have an impact on the real life. So if you can simulate that somehow, like if you have a phone in your hand, you usually have to use maybe the dexterity of your dominant hand fully, and that leaves you with your indominant hand trying to do something else. So if you're working through a pairing process or an onboarding process, or like you can be on top of stairs, for example, if you need to press multiple buttons at the same time, I really encourage everybody to look into like what is happening in real life all the time when you are, you know, designing your interface, because the confines of these like rectangular glossy display is very, very fun, and it's very shiny and it's exciting, but people have a life, you know. Babies are crying, phones are ringing, you know, fires are happening, things are falling down, and so people have to lock your app and to go to do something else. What is happening meanwhile? I think to be able to understand all of these things, it's really important to be able to, let's say, pre-empathize with the users before you can make mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you could almost say that inclusivity are basically an enabler for innovation, or like basically a creative input for innovation. Because as you said, life is not perfect. You have different things going around. Like maybe you just have one hand available for the interaction. Maybe you try to do something in the sink and don't have your hands available at all, right? And you know, incorporating that kind of lens to the scenario building, I think that could greatly I think influence creativity. I assume when it comes to the brainstorming and coming up with different use cases, right?
Definitely. And I also I can connect this back to even my days with mobile technologies and mobile phones. I don't know if anybody remembers, but once upon a time, phones did not have an on-off button. You were actually turning off the phone by, you know, or locking the phone by long pressing the back button most of the time. And like a lot of people did not realize this, but that meant that you had to leave what you were doing behind. So there was no multitasking between what you were doing digitally and what you were doing physically. So when you get back to unlock the phone, it was the home screen. And as the phones became more and more advanced, this became more and more of a problem. So when I was working with more like very early smartphones, we realized that, my God, we need an on-off button. Otherwise, you have to just go back to that app, and maybe the memory was not enough, and you know, you got kicked out of what you were doing. So life is much more important than whatever app that you're working with most of the time, unless you're working with something mission critical. So I would also say that, you know, the body storming, or maybe sometimes, you know, video prototyping, you know, these kind of techniques are quite important in understanding. And I think that what you described before, with the, maybe some people call it the Wizard of Oz prototyping, that also helps quite a lot in terms of understanding how people feel and what their attitude is towards a certain technology or some innovation, I think.
Yeah, super interesting. And I think basically looking at what you're building now up at IKEA, you're basically saying you're building up a team there, right? Another thing, I think there's an interesting conversation going around design disciplines and different kind of skill sets of designers when it comes to building these very complex designs, right? Where we have physical, you have digital. Yeah, I mean, everything comes together. You have audio, you have multi-sensor experiences, basically, and I mean, also things like service design, I think, are probably relevant there, because you have to stitch it together somehow into a customer experience. So there's definitely an element of complexity, and I'm wondering a little bit, what are the different kind of skill sets of designers you're looking for when you kind of assemble a team that could kind of deal with these challenges and deal with the different aspects that you have to tackle when it comes to a smart home experience.
That's the part is very interesting because when industrial design was just industrial design, you can say everybody was an industrial designer, and some people called themselves like maybe specialists like, okay, transportation designer, or some people called themselves furniture designer, but there were very few number of specializations. But today there is quite a lot. Like in my point of view, it was very interesting when we started this team. The first hire was a UX researcher, which was an amazing level of maturity that I had in hindsight. I didn't really think about it much back then. But then the second was a business designer. And we are more and more aware that the front end of the process is super important in shaping the rest of it. And these two are extremely important disciplines that really bring the voice of the user, the voice of the customer, the voice of the whole market into the mix before you start even drawing rectangles on a screen or making mock-ups in a 3D printer. But I also think that we expanded the team later with UX designers and visual designers. But now I think one of the most interesting hires now is a design technologist, which is basically a bridge between design and technology. Maybe it's more of a designer than a technologist, but I do believe that it is a very crucial bridge that cannot be replaced with any meeting, really, because you're talking about a person that can use prototyping as a super powerful tool that can make anything that you're talking about tangible in a matter of days, maybe sometimes hours. And then that cuts a lot of theoretical decisions quite short and makes them super practical. And you understand the implications of your decisions, like like I said before. Sometimes some decisions are super hard to foresee in terms of their impact. So you're making that much more tangible by having a design technologist in the mix. And I also believe that like service designers have a very interesting tool set of understanding what human aspect means when it comes to designing systems. So that is also very, very valuable. And maybe one of the most underrated but crucial roles is UX writer, because everything that you do has to have some kind of a verbal expression that is tied to it. If it's on an app, or if it's maybe a user manual or something like that, and the wrong word might show you the wrong way fundamentally, that might actually push the user down a spiral that they can never get out of. So I do feel like it's very important. But these are all, UX professionals. I also think that we owe ourselves to build very, very strong relationships with people like product owners and engineers and marketers and communicators, which usually most of the time in our process we oversimplify the relationship between different professions. But I do think that we have to embrace the complexity and try to bring everybody in. And inclusion is not only inclusive design, but it's also inclusion in the workplace. That also brings a lot of richness, I think, to the discussions.
Yeah, inclusion in the process, right? Super interesting. And I can also see that, definitely see what you pointing out there when it comes to the different designers. Especially I think design technologists must be quite critical, specifically for quick prototyping and all of the different things. And the tools just get better basically every year, right? And it's getting more and more simpler to to build these things, and the frameworks get better basically every year. So I think that's super interesting. I mean, I would really like to maybe as a last question in regards of the smart home aspect, what do you think are kind of the future challenges, but then also opportunities when it comes to the smart home space?
Another good question. I would say some aspects of the smart home makes me feel very optimistic and excited, and some other aspects are also, let's say, okay, I'm thinking about things that we have to solve along the way. And of course, as a part of the this journey, I feel responsible for solving those. But I do feel like we are in a transition period. So we have to recognize that first and foremost. A lot of the smart home solutions that we have today are what you would call retrofit. We have smart bulbs because we don't have like smart switches, and we have a lot of things that, for example, you don't have smart windows, so you bring in smart blinds and so on. I think maybe the difference between let's say a phone and the smartphone has disappeared so quickly, maybe in a matter of half a decade, one might argue. But the difference between a home and the smart home will not disappear that fast, because we don't discard homes every a year or a year and a half. So it's going to take a very long time to do the full transition. And until that transition is complete, you can say, we're going to have to rely on a lot of retrofit. And that means a mishmash of different, brands and the compatibility issues, maybe, and maybe it's all growing pains. Um, but I also feel like companies are maturing. We are growing. We are understanding what the users want, rather than what technology wants. Because technology just wants progress. Maybe technology does not want to be meaningful. But people need the technology to be meaningful for their lives, to be understandable, and to be respectful to both people and planets. And that's what we are trying to maybe insert in our everyday life. Like if you are aware of where you are in the overall process, maybe you can do the progress a little bit easier.
I mean, another aspect that's probably there important, I think, is culture, right? I mean, you also have the element that spaces are very different in different cultures as well, right? So you have to think about that as well, because I mean, even a kitchen setup is so different when it comes to in India versus in Europe versus in the US, right? So I think that's kind of interesting, and I really like what you're pointing out there is that like the change is not happening so quick, so you have to work in a kind of mixed environment where some of the spaces are further and maybe some more intelligent, more enabled, and others are not, right? And then you have to think about how does it fit in there. And the change is happening slower, right? You have products that kind of change quicker. Maybe even a car transforms, or let's say the transformation change is happening maybe even quicker than in the space, where people change that even, or upgrade things even slower than even mobility aspects, right? And then you have basically cities which are even slower, right? It's probably the slowest kind of space you could design for. So super interesting. How did you think the experience at TEAGUE, where you worked a lot on aviation experiences, right, which are kind of also space design, if you want to describe it that way? How did they prepare you for your basically projects and roles at IKEA?
I think one of the most interesting things were the discipline around understanding experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and being like making the experiences, or the understanding process is a humbling process.
Mm-hmm.
Like understanding the complexity of such a thing, because my creative director at TEAGUE used to call the airplane a flying building, with all the plumbing and electricity and everything. And I really love that. And if you think about it like that, it is a home really. And sometimes for 8 hours or 12 hours or 2 hours, that little space that you get, like a quite expensive seat, is your home. And you are nesting, like micro nesting, for a very short period of time. And you are a captive audience. The only place that you can look is in front of you. And it's very confining. And for example, the perception of light changes, the perception of taste changes. Like all of the five senses are impacted by being high up and being confined. But at the same time, I would say, like, there's also practical aspects that really impacted me. One thing is that I stopped maybe saying important too much when I was talking about design, because when you're talking about planes, important means something pretty specific. So you can't really waste that word on, for example, passenger comfort, to be honest, when you're talking about the design of a plane. And on the other side, like I learned a lot about lighting and the impact of lighting on human psyche, and even like the perception of time and circadian rhythms and so on. But I would say the most important thing that I learned is how to understand the cycle of understanding the journey from start to finish. For example, if you take the user journey of going on a plane, you can say that it starts from like you going through the plane door and leaving through the plane door. But in fact, it starts by you starting to plan a vacation, and it ends when you actually unpack and maybe start doing your laundry from your dirty stuff. So really appreciating the complexity and the halo effect of experiences was a very good learning for me.
Super interesting, super interesting. Yeah, and you have to think about all these different sensors, like you were saying, and there's some really interesting projects, like you were pointing out how the light is changing, particular in certain scenarios of your flight to create a certain experience. Yeah, I think this is super interesting. Maybe as the last question, you have been reinventing yourself in your career quite often, right? You had different roles, sometimes more physical, sometimes more digital, right? And you were going to new spaces like aviation or now smart home. And I think this is true to the role of designers more and more, that you have to kind of keep reinventing yourself, and the change is happening, the transformation is all around you. So you have to deal with that as a designer, right? It's not that you learn something after you study and you're done, you're set for 60 years. This doesn't exist, right? So I'm wondering a little bit, what would be your advice for designers to keep on reinventing themselves and to keep up with the change that is happening?
I would say that if you don't understand that learning is life, then I think design is a very, very tough profession to deal with. You're gonna have to learn new things all the time, and if you have any resistance against that, I think it's a very hellish dream to be a designer. But also, I will give away my age now a little bit, talking about like when I was studying bachelor to be an industrial designer. They did not allow us to use computers to 3D model things, because they thought that we have to learn sketching and doing perspective, like 3-point perspective with hand and all of that. And we've done it anyway. We find 3D modeling software, piloted it, and come hell or high water, we found a way to do it ourselves. And I think that the people who are maybe more interesting are understanding this fact that learning is a privilege, and learning is something that you do maybe every waking hour. And if you maybe understand this fact, then I think you can definitely understand how to be a designer and how to evolve, because the technology is evolving. But even if it's not evolving, like research techniques are evolving, and even if research techniques are not evolving, humans are evolving. We're having pandemics and we're having climate change, and different things are. So if you're not aware of many of these things, I don't think that it will be super fun to design things for the realities.
Yeah, super interesting what you're saying, right? Learning is life, especially true for designers, right? And I think there's this openness aspect as well, that, I think we were pointing out your education there, right? I kind of got to know that as well when it came to sketching, for example, and like there were these first digital sketching methods, right? And then there was this conversation where should we stick to the paper, or how about this new thing with digital sketching? Is this a future or not, right? And nowadays you need to embrace that as well, right? You need to embrace the change and kind of be open towards that and see how you can make it work for you. I think that's an important element as well. So yeah, I think I would love to continue talking to you here in the episode. Super interesting insights you have been sharing. So, but I think we need to close and wrap up the recording here. So thank you so much, Bilgi. This has been absolutely amazing.
The same for me. Thank you, Sebastian. Always a pleasure.
All right, that was the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments or by tagging me in the post what were the biggest learnings for you in the episode. I'm always super curious about that. If the episode provided you a lot of value, make sure to follow and subscribe and share it with friends or others so they also have the chance to learn and grow themselves. All right, until next time, cheers.